Welcome. My name is Martine Larocque. I'm a Burlington School Commissioner and a member of the Coalition for Vermont Student Equity. I'll be acting as MC today, and including myself, there are 5 speakers. In short, I'm here to thank the task force on the implementation of the Pupil Weighting Factors report for their hard work this summer, and to ask them to listen to Vermonters who've been harmed by decades of inequality and inequity. We're asking them to correct the flawed funding formula. As you may know, in 2019, at the request of the legislature, a report was written by a team led by experts at UVM and Rutgers that definitively concluded Vermont does not properly account for the cost of educating children who attend rural schools, children who come from low-income households, and children who require English language learning services. The formula used by the state to distribute education funds has been wrong for over 20 years. For example, I've seen the ease with which overweighted districts can add staff to their schools and create positions that allow them to meet education quality standards. I have personally experienced working in a library with a budget 10 times that in my local high school. I have seen staff in underweighted districts doing the work of 2 or 3 staff members in an overweighted district. This inequitable formula stretches some districts, places unnecessary burdens on staff, and ultimately has an impact on student achievement. For years, I was baffled by the discrepancies I saw in funding between districts, and now that I understand the flaws in the weighting system, I understand the origin of these inequities. The words equity and inclusion appear to be central to the work that we do as educators, and I've heard them used hundreds of times in the last few years by school leaders and administrators. Are they conveniently being used to quiet historically marginalized communities, or are we truly committed to equity and inclusion? We have an opportunity to put our words into action. If we're truly committed to improving student outcomes and narrowing the opportunity gap for all Vermont students, we must implement the more equitable formula as recommended in the 2019 Pupil Weighting Factors report. I would like to now introduce our next speaker, which is going to be McLaughlin. He is the superintendent of Springfield School District, and we will take questions once all of our speakers have done have completed their comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here with all of you today. Again, my name is McLaughlin. I am the superintendent of schools in Springfield. I want to today take an opportunity to thank the task force for all the work that they have done up to this point. It is very challenging to try to redesign such an important system, but we're at a really important moment where the politics of what we're trying to deal with as we look at how to allocate resources have an opportunity to dovetail with empirical evidence and research that's been presented by this report. And I want to encourage the task force to embrace that report as much as it possibly can. Vermont has a special vision that is unique, and it was one that called me from out of state to come here, both as a parent, but also as an educator. That vision, which you find within the Constitution, uniquely in the Vermont Constitution, says that all kids matter and that our state community has a responsibility to make sure that we fulfill that promise. And that has then gone through as a thread through the Brigham decision, through Act 60, Act 68. This commitment and this ongoing refinement of how are we going to fulfill that promise. And the reality is, in districts like mine, who face cyclical poverty, is the pain is real for our families and for our students. And if we're going to have students have that access to education, real access with real equitable outcomes, we have to be able to provide the resources to put them in a position to access that education. And in a period of time where human services are not funded at the levels we'd like to see, it falls upon the schools to do a lot of things that at one point schools didn't do to make sure that education is accessible. In communities like Springfield, as a result of those services not being available, students suffer. And as a result of students suffering, our community suffers. And this has happened for a long period of time. What is being presented and what is being discussed is not really new. It's just a recalibration of a vision that already exists for Vermont. Every student should matter and every student should count. And over time, we've had to recalibrate how do we do that. This is just another opportunity to have that occur. The task force has a chance to take advantage, and the legislature has an opportunity to take advantage of the research that's been done by some very renowned people, and I hope that we take advantage of that opportunity to get back to fulfilling that promise that we made in the Constitution. So I thank you, and I'll turn it to our next speaker.
Good morning. I'm Roy Thibault, the chair of the Cabot School Board. On Monday evening, our board voted unanimously to join the Coalition for Vermont Student Equity. And 3 of our board members had a previous opportunity to testify in front of the task force on pupil weighting. We are incredibly appreciative of the work that the task force has done thus far and will continue to do in working through this topic and also considering our positions. With that said, I want to share Cabot's experience with you and why it's vitally important that we correct a flawed education finance formula. Like many small districts, Cabot did not have an easy time navigating the Act 46 process. Because we were a small school, many rushed to the conclusion that we were inefficient because we were small and that our high per pupil spending was a consequence merely of size. That conclusion glossed over a reality that we knew then and has been validated now by the UVM Rutgers study, that student and community needs vary, that factors like poverty, the number of students requiring special services, the number of students who require English language instruction, all impact the services that a school must provide to meet the most basic needs of our student population. Beyond what visitors see when they come to Cabot, whether our famed creamery or our pastoral views, there's a sobering reality that behind that we have a well above average juvenile and youth poverty rate. Under 18 poverty is well above both the state average and the town average. What that signifies is many of our children are in need. Many of our children have experienced trauma or adverse childhood experiences. It's upon our school to help get them ready for what lies ahead of them. The statistics in Cabot bear out like many other small rural communities. Over 50% of our students are eligible for free or reduced lunch, and 23% of our students receive special services. To put that in context, we're in a large supervisory union. We make up just 10% of the students in that supervisory union, and yet we account for 17% of the special education funding. We pride ourselves on our excellent reputation of serving children who do have those additional needs, but it's becoming increasingly difficult. Under the existing weighting of pupils, our spending is benchmarked against districts that do not have these elevated needs. It means that we face these challenges without the benefit of any correction of the formula. Despite drastically restructuring our school and right-sizing our faculty and staff, we continue to bump up against what's called the excess spending threshold, meaning we are penalized when we do what we have to do to meet students' basic needs. This has pushed us to the brink in an unfortunate cycle of having to cut opportunities and services that would benefit all students in order to just meet our minimum educational quality standards. The consequences of this unfair system are real, inequitable, and unjust. However, the UVM Rutgers study provides us with clear and empirical basis for setting pupil weights. I urge the task force to adopt the weighting recommendations, as this is the only means to truly address the systemic inequity caused by the funding formula. We see this play out in districts as different in size and population as Winooski and Burlington versus small districts like Cabot and Peacham. This is not something that's unique to the Vermont urban or rural divide. Rather, it impacts schools because we're all dealing with different challenges. We're concerned that categorical grants, if applied here, will fall into the same pitfalls that small school grants have. They are subject to uncertainty. They can change from year to year based upon politics or the health of the general or the education fund or the general fund. And they're not based on evidence. What we have here, critically, is that an evidence-based application of pupil weighting. Ultimately, it's our view in the Cabot School District that categorical grants would send the message that districts struggling under the existing formula need to be subsidized, which implies that they're poor in their governance or that they're making wasteful policy decisions. Ultimately, what we're asking for is predictability and consistency in education finance. We're asking that education finance be guided by equity and the Common Benefits Clause. We're asking for fairness going forward, not redress for the past inequities driven by the system or lost opportunities. We're asking for local boards and communities to be trusted as good stewards of school finance. And finally, I'm asking that we place our Vermont values first in this conversation. Since the Brigham decision in 1997, we have recognized the importance of bringing equitable opportunities to all students. The task force and legislature have the opportunity to finally align our education finance system with these values. Thank you.
Many people spoke at a recent public hearing calling for Vermont to adopt a plan that corrects the formula used to distribute education funds to rural and low-income districts known as pupil weighting. Every single person spoke in favor of making the change, and it's time for the task force to put forward a plan that rejects categorical aid and implements equitable pupil weighting formula. A truly equitable pupil weighting system will allow struggling districts to make decisions that are best for their students and their communities. To this end, our members have written a letter to the task force, which I'm going to read for you now. Madam Chairs and members of the task force on the implementation of the pupil weighting factors report. It's a really long task force name, which we're known for here in Vermont, sorry. Thank you for taking the time to serve on this important task force. As staff, members, and supporters of rights and democracy, we feel it is imperative to voice our strong support for correcting the pupil weighting system in Vermont, rather than considering categorical aid. This is the only option that will advance equity in Vermont's education funding formula and in our overall public education system. The current formula fails to properly account for the cost of educating children who attend small schools, rural schools, come from low-income households, or require English language learning services. Correcting the formula rather than imposing a categorical aid system will do the following. It will show struggling districts that you trust them to make the local spending decisions that most benefit their students, as wealthy districts are already able to. It will use an empirical basis to set pupil weights, unlike alternative proposals. It will address the inequities that are baked into the current formula. It will map out students' needs across districts, similar to what a census does, and therefore accurately reflect the cost of educating different learners. It will address Vermont's constitutional obligation to reflect real-world costs of educating all children. We urge you to see the problematic ways in which categorical aid would affect school funding, including leaving spending decisions under the control of the legislature without direct knowledge of how distribution choices will affect low-income, rural, and diverse districts, failing to address the inequities that are part of the current formula, leaving most impacted vulnerable to fluctuations in funding depending on who is in state political office at a given time, and preventing districts, especially struggling ones, from making long-term plans. As you prepare to make a final decision on this important shift in the way we fund our Vermont schools, we urge you to choose the option that will clearly support greater equity and inclusion. If you value equity in all of our systems, correcting the pupil weighting formula is the only viable option moving forward. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Nicole, and I'm the finance manager for the Winooski School District, and I am grateful to be joined today by some colleagues from the district, Abir and Tool, and some students from the district. Thank you so much for reminding us what this conversation is really all about, and thanks for being here. In 1997, in Brigham v. State, the Vermont Supreme Court concluded that the Vermont Constitution requires the state to provide substantially equal educational opportunity to all students. The Brigham Court wrote, quote, "The distribution of a resource as precious as educational opportunity may not have as its determining force the mere fortuity of a child's residence. Since 1997, Vermont's legislature has committed to delivering more equitable access to educational resources to Vermont students. The UVM study on pupil weighting factors clarified that we have more work to do. This work is challenging, as equity requires redistributing resources, and we are appreciative of the task force's efforts to develop a plan to move us forward. The UVM study clarified the extent of the gap between the resources available to Winooski students and their needs. In Winooski School District, 62% of our students live in poverty. 33% of our students are multilingual learners. 27% of our students qualify for special education services. As the UVM study clearly indicates, the current funding weights are not keeping pace with the needs of our students and do not reflect the actual costs we incorporate into our local budget. In communities like Winooski, where we have high levels of poverty and have chronically underfunded schools over many years, building up staffing to better meet the needs of students is very difficult. The current weights do not give us the flexibility to make the staffing investments we know we need to make in our local budget. The pandemic illuminated the dire need for greater investments to better serve our students. Winooski made the decision to invest federal COVID funds in increased staffing and interventionists, including the addition of 3 multilingual liaisons, a district-wide literacy coordinator, and 2 additional multilingual educators. But using one-time money to fund programs and staffing is inherently risky. But the needs of our students and families are so substantial that we felt we must use the funds the way they were intended to support vulnerable populations in our community. Unfortunately, when the federal funding goes away, so will the staff. This outcome could be avoided if the legislature corrects the weights. One option currently under consideration by the task force, categorical aid, is inequitable for the following reasons. The UVM study uses a research-based empirical approach to correcting the weights. It's not clear what empirical basis would be used to determine how to establish categorical aid amounts, which would then subject funding for high-needs districts like Winooski to a political and uncertain process. Categorical aid would shift the burden and risk to marginalized communities that have been underfunded for decades, as opposed to shared risk and responsibility across all districts. Because the amount of categorical aid would be unknown year to year, staffing would be subject to even greater instability, which may discourage teachers from taking positions in high poverty schools, greater disadvantaging districts like Winooski. Categorical aid would mean a tax increase for everyone. Even underweighted districts like Winooski would have to contribute taxes towards categorical aid. I'd like to close with a definition of equity in a model policy currently being considered by school districts across Vermont, which in part states, quote, equity means that each student receives the resources and educational opportunities they need to learn and thrive. Equity goes beyond formal equality, where all students are treated the same. Achieving equity may require an unequal distribution of resources and services. The Winooski School District is calling upon the task force to develop a plan to implement the recommendations of the UVM Pupil Weighting Factors report in order to ensure that our funding formula distributes resources equitably to all students. Thank you.
Thank you, speakers. We will now take questions. The 5, myself and the 4 other speakers will take any questions that you might have.
I'm curious in Nicole and Winooski's case, if the weighting were with proper weighting, as you would define it, how much more money would the Winooski School District receive annually?
Well, Stuart, just so happens. So it's less about the amount of money and it's more about the taxing capacity. That would be, I looked at FY22 budget figures. Using the current law, education equalized pupil count for Winooski, results in education spending per equalized pupil, which is what the tax rates are set off of. It's $17,130. Using the weights in the UVM report, our spending per equalized pupil would be $10,165. That's a 41% decrease.
Members of the coalition talked about the compounding effects of the existing rating system. I'm wondering at what point do you pivot from asking the legislature for reforms and demanding money from the courts? Oh, all right, I'll steer. Did you hear me?
I did hear you. He's asking about at what point do we get to ask I mean, I can try.
Got a lawyer up there.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
You just want me to get political for you, but I think the fact that we've made it this far and the legislature put as much careful deliberation as it did into the study and creating the task force is indicative that everyone recognizes that there is a need for change. And today the debate seems centered on how best to get to that change. So I think we're a long way away from having to get to the point of demanding anything. And I think we can look to our political leadership in the state and take them at face value that everyone does care about equity in education finance. And sure, there's a tax rate at the end of it, but what we're really talking about are opportunities for kids. And if we're going to build back better in Vermont, then that needs to be done with students who are prepared to face a really changing and evolving world. And as Vermonters, I think we do recognize, as we made reference to the Common Benefits Clause in the Constitution, it's something that matters, and there are things that set Vermont apart, and part of that is taking care of all Vermonters.
If there are no other questions, then thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate it.